Alright, so I've been hosting challenge mode convergences for both the Soto and the Janthir Wilds ones every single week for well over 3 months now. And with the exception of a single run, we always get the gold rewards, usually with around 2 minutes or more left on the timer for the Janthir Wild ones. Which is really cool by the way, because according to fast farming, that means that we're making around 100 gold an hour. Which this time is a number you can actually take at face value, because you do need to do them in less than 20 minutes if you're hoping to get a gold chest. Although I'm also going to be the first to admit that all 3 together will take around an hour and 15 minutes if you account for the squad setup and some of the downtime between the bosses. Now what I didn't know was that less than 2% of all people who have registered an account on GW2 Efficiency have ever gotten the gold rewards, which came as a bit of a surprise with how smooth our runs have been going, especially if you account for the fact that our runs are open to anyone and that we usually get a couple of newcomers who haven't even set foot in a strike mission yet, although we did come up with a couple of very specific strategies to save time to make this possible. Now, I'm not telling you all of this to gloat by the way, but I do want to point out that everybody can do this. And by having our groups the way we do, we get to have both veteran and new players in the same runs without compromise for either, whether they want to experience a massive 50-man fight together or whether they just want their easy weekly clears for the rewards. Okay, so I've mentioned that we have a couple of specific strategies and we do have those both for the convergence as a whole, as well as some boss strategies. So we're gonna tackle them bit by bit, because you can basically split up each of the convergences into 3 different phases. As you'll first need to defeat 4 sets of enemies while escorting a Dolyak, then you'll want to build and defend Thumpers, and finally you want to beat either a living rock or a tree. Now, while the boss fight is of course the main part of the convergence everybody's looking forward to, ensuring those gold rewards actually already starts in phase 1, as you'll want to take care of those waves of enemies as fast as you can, and also have at least one player with super speed escort the Dolyak. Now, super speed is a bit of a fickle buff by the way, as it caps out at 10 seconds and can only be shared with 5 targets, and it's always gonna prioritize players over NPCs. So that means that the only person near the Dolyak should be the one actually sharing the super speed. And if you have multiple people doing this, have them move away from the Dolyak as soon as they share theirs. As soon as the Dolyak arrives to the base camp, the timer will actually stop for quite some time and you might actually be inclined to stand around until phase 2 happens. But if you want to ensure a gold run, everybody should mount up on their Warclaw instead and do a tour through the mountain while breaking 6 walls, which will each drop essences for every single player. These are massively important by the way, as they're the resource needed to advance to the next phase by handing them in at the base camp, but they can also be used to rest people throughout the convergence, although this is something you don't want to do in the Janthir Wild ones, and they also massively improve your damage at the cost of some total HP. Or in other words, DPS will want to be as close to the cap of 50 whenever they're fighting the boss. Although they shouldn't worry about this during phase 2 yet, as getting to the boss should take actual priority. Now the reason we go on this excursion is pretty simple, because if everybody goes and collects those essences, the whole squad will have around 1500 extra to start phase 2. But here's the kicker, when everybody's back at base camp, make sure no one hands in their essence yet, because in this phase you need to build 5 Thumpers, and as long as those are active, they're gonna award you with an essence multiplier, meaning an even faster end to this phase. Now before we move on though, let's talk about the actual phase, which is fairly simple, but some extra coordination can go a long way to not only speed up the phase, but also making sure that newcomers don't get lost, as the whole squad will need to split up into 6 groups where one stays behind and defends the base camp, while the others all go to a build site, unearth the Thumper, and then have to defend it for roughly 2 minutes until a champion spawns. Some of the build sites are really easy to get to, but quite often people get lost when going to the eastern one, or they take way too long of a route to the northern one. Now there's also a second potential risk, as 2 of the Thumpers will only have a single sub assigned to them, and since a Thumper requires 5 total supply to build, that means that neither of the middle ones can fall behind. Now we did figure that it was unrealistic to always assign experienced players to those, because we sometimes might not have enough of them, and more often than that, I can't actually remember the name of hundreds of players who sign up throughout the month. So instead, we came up with another solution, as we have something called a special role sub, which are 5 experienced players that will deal with some of the boss mechanics, but we also give each of them a marker so that anyone who doesn't know where to go can simply follow one of them. But then there's also the base camp, which needs to be defended, but realistically can be done solo or by 2 players if you want to play it safe. So to further ensure that sub 9 and 10's Thumper will get built instantly, we do send a couple of our base camp players with them as well. And afterwards, all they have to do is focus on collecting and depositing essences, as the base camp really only ever needs 2 players at most. Now, I do feel it's important to talk about a known bug though, and that's if 5 people with supplies are all standing on a Thumper while it is being unearthed. If that happens, it's gonna bug out and can't be built anymore, at which point you're actually better off resetting the instance. Now this can be easily mitigated by having one person already move to the Thumpers while the rest are waiting for the supplies to spawn at base camp, because with the structure I just explained, you should always have enough people carrying supplies to build theirs. The rest of this phase is really simple. Just defend your Thumper until a champion spawns, and then once it does, make sure that no one ever stands between it and the Thumper, because their charge attack could one-shot your Thumper and then make you lose out on those essence multipliers. After that, people should just collect essence and hand them in. Although, if your squad followed all of the steps so far, then there's gonna be around 10% of essence, if not less, left to donate once all of the champions die. I do want to give one more bonus tip though, and that's if you're done and you're collecting essence either to hand in or to start the boss phase with as much essence as possible so that you can top the DPS meters, then go and collect where sub 9's Thumper was built. If the boss happens to spawn while you're still collecting, then you can simply cross over to the boss area in a couple of seconds. And that brings me to the actual boss phases, and we usually tackle all of them in a very specific order by starting with Ura, then Decima, and then finally Greer, as you'll have more margin for error with the first two, which means that you can use those runs to get the whole squad used to playing the pre-event as good as they can. Which also brings me back to the special role sub I mentioned before, because those 5 players are gonna carry most of the mechanics, so that the rest of the squad can simply focus on DPS instead of surviving. Ura is gonna be really simple to deal with, as she only has a few swipe attacks that require stability or Aegis to prevent getting knocked down, and an attack that will see her raise her hands and encase everybody in a bubble that floats up. And then there's also a jump that will downstate anyone standing under her while she lands, unless they have Aegis. We are gonna deal with none of those mechanics though, well, except maybe for the jump, because we'll have one of the players of that special sub rush to the boss, so that they're the first one in the arena and can grab its aggro by simply being the first to stand in front of them. If this is done correctly, that means that all 49 others can simply stand behind the boss, and all they'll have to do is make sure that they're not under her when she lands. And since the healers will have virtually nothing to do, they can swap to a Celestial build and focus on dealing with the break bar so that Ura both takes increased damage for a short time, but also removes that nasty buff that makes her take less damage. Every 25%, each of the 3 bosses will always move to another part of the mountain, and the whole squad should mount up on their Warclaw. Now, instead of racing to be the very first in the next area, everybody should instead focus on collecting Titan's Stench, because when enough has been gathered, everybody will get a special action key that will airdrop them near the boss. So make sure your whole squad focuses on collecting Stench, not necessarily taking the shortest route to the boss. The next boss in our lineup is usually Decima, who will also have a slam attack that knocks back, as well as a jump that would downstate you if you're under her. But this one doesn't move around at all, so everybody should just be stacking relatively close to the boss so that they're in melee range. And the support should of course be trying to provide permanent stability and Aegis every time she jumps up. Now there is another set of mechanics to deal with though, and that's the arrows, as she'll either spawn one or multiple orange ones that will need to be directed in between pylons littered around the arena, or a red one that should have the targeted player hide behind the pylon. Although again, we don't do that last bit. Instead, we make sure that the targeted player mounts up on their Warclaw, which will sacrifice their mount, but will let them walk away unscathed. Now, the arrows will always target the furthest players, so what we do is have our special sub stand as far away from the squad as possible, so that they will not only always be the furthest away from the boss, but also so that no arrows should ever go through the group. Now, sometimes Decima also spawns a bunch of green circles, although this has been very inconsistent for us during the convergences, where sometimes she would spawn none at all, and sometimes she would litter the field. If this happens, have some people from the melee squad disperse, stand in them, and then rejoin the group. And that brings me to the final and the most difficult of the 3 bosses. Now, Greer isn't necessarily that much harder, but the fight will be so much more chaotic that accidents will happen. Unlike the 2 previous bosses, Greer will also bring 2 of his friends, Rig and Gree, and both of them will litter the field with deadly AoEs, but will have relatively low HP. So what we do for those is designate 2 times 2 subs, in our case usually subs 9 through 12, and send them to deal with the adds at the start of every single phase, because once they die, the fight becomes that much easier. Just like Ura, you'll want everybody to stack at the back of the boss, but unlike her, this boss will change aggro every time somebody walks in front or runs through their hitbox. So everyone should really try to make sure to avoid doing this as much as possible. Now, I know from experience that this is gonna happen a few times throughout the fight though, at which point the whole group should just touch through the boss's hitbox to the back, and the support should be spamming stability and whatever healing they can spare. Now, the reason everybody can stack at the back is of course of that special roll sub, But instead of just one player tanking like we have on Ura, we're gonna have the whole sub-tank Greer, because he has a combo of nasty knockdowns and knockbacks, tons of projectile attacks that will constantly need to be reflected or blocked, and he's also gonna inflict a number of conditions, and sometimes all of this at the same time. So that sub's task is to bring as much mitigation as possible so that the rest of the squad can focus on killing the boss. Now, once you kill the ads, things will stabilize and the group in the back shouldn't have to do too many mechanics anymore. One of the attacks that can reach the group will be a knockdown, but there's gonna be a safe zone if you're standing right on his back. And just like the arrows he spawns can also be completely ignored with stability, which the support should bring for this fight anyway. Another is his breath attack, that will see clouds of purple smoke move towards a group in the back that will inflict conditions, but those can actually immediately be cleansed and out-healed. At that point, the only true danger is if a mechanic would fail, like somebody not stacking the greens, or if one of the ads didn't time fast enough, because that will typically spawn a massive zone of death that is likely to downstate a lot of players. If that happens, again, don't panic, just res your friends and rejoin the group. Then lastly, there's one more thing you'll have to deal with, and that's at 80, 60, 30 and 10%, Greer is going to become immune to damage until you destroy his break bar. While this happens, he's also going to start raining heavy damage dealing projectiles on everybody, which the healers should be blocking with either their projectile block or reflection, while they're also spamming condition cleanse in the case one of them gets through. And since nobody can deal damage anyway at this point, the rest of the squad should deal with the break bar, for which you don't even need to bring extra abilities by the way, because if enough people mount up on their Warclaw, they can just spam 4, 3, 4, 1 and deal enough break bar damage that way. And that's also basically all you need to know about these fights. But let's maybe also go quickly over how you can turn all of the resources that you're gonna get into gold. The materials, unidentified gear and unstable motivations are simple, as all of those can be sold on a trading post. Now, if you do happen to get a yellow miniature though, also make sure you check its price on the trading post, because not everybody might want to bind that one to their account after they see how much people are paying for those. Another large part of the profit is going to be in the form of all 3 of the Rift Essences though, for which Fast Farming actually has an excellent overview of what you should be doing with them. But I do want to elaborate on a couple of the choices you can make, because everybody's use case might be a bit different. See, the tier 1 and 2 essences are normally best crafted into motivations and then sold on the trading post. And since around 1 to 2,000 of those sell per day, this is probably the best way forward for most people. But if at one point too many people are trying to sell too many at once, then they'll start tanking the price. So either sell them in batches, or if you're okay with a bit less profit, you could consider some of the other options. Next in line are the End of Dragon's Writs, which is also the best option for your tier 3 essences, which can be consumed for Imperial Favor and then crafted into a precursor, which doesn't take that much extra work, as they don't require you to do map completion or Wolfie World unlike the actual Arene legendaries. Although again, if you don't mind a bit of extra work, the legendaries are probably even better value. Now, if you don't want to bother with crafting at all, then you can still exchange all of your essences for Tyrian defense seals and trade those in for Squid supply boxes. Doing this means that you lose about half of the value of your essences though, but I do want to include this option as I know not everybody wants to craft and some gold is always better than none at all. And that's it. I run these convergences at least once a week, so if you want to be part of those, just join my Discord and sign up through our very own LFG channel. Now I do have to say though that our groups fill up within an hour or two, but we also always have a couple of no-shows on the day of the event, so if you want to snag one of those spots, just make sure to follow me on Twitch, as I tend to fill those spots with people who are in my chat.